I am a farmer and I know every corner of my ranch. But that day something made me stop when I saw a pregnant young woman crying next to the weakest cow in my herd. She was stroking the animal as if she were trying to protect it, and that already seemed strange enough. Except when I got closer and saw what was really happening there, I realized that scene hid something I never expected to find. But before I tell you what I discovered in that moment, I want you to watch this story until the end and then comment what you thought. Give it a rating from 0 to 10 and tell me what city you are watching me from. I really want to get to know you better. And if you like the story, subscribe to the channel to support my work. The rain didn't give any warning when it arrived. It came down all at once, as if the sky had waited for the absolute worst moment to open up. And out here on the Texas plains, when the rain falls like that, in a sudden torrential downpour, the mud turns into a trap, the dirt road disappears, and folks get stuck where they are, whether they want to or not. That was why Thomas shouldn't have stepped off the porch that early morning. There was no reason to. But something he couldn't even explain himself pushed him out. A low, almost animal-like cry, mixed with the sound of the rain beating against the tin roof. He grabbed the rusted flashlight that hung by the door and stumbled across the muddy yard, the muck reaching his shins, the rain soaking his shirt before he could even take 3 steps. In the most forgotten corner of the pasture, far from the main corral, far from the new holding pens, right where Daisy stood, the oldest and weakest cow in the herd, the one everyone on the ranch had already written off, there was a figure crouched in the mud. A young woman, heavily pregnant, hugging the animal's neck as if that were the only warmth available in the entire world. She didn't ask for help. She didn't make a single sign. She was just crying quietly, her forehead resting against Daisy's wet snout, while the cow licked her face with a patience that even Thomas found strange for such a mistreated beast. He stopped. The flashlight trembled in his hand, and before he could say a word, the young woman lifted her face, looked straight at him, and spoke a name that Thomas hadn't heard in over 15 years. Her father's name. Emily was the young woman's name, daughter of James, the ranch hand that Thomas had let go on a cold November morning, many years ago, after a bitter argument that neither of them had ever resolved. James had left without saying where he was headed. Emily had grown up without a father, without land, without any roots, and now here she was, 8 months pregnant, without ID, without money, without anyone. She had arrived at the ranch following an old piece of information her mother had left behind before passing away. That the only place where James had ever been truly happy, before everything went wrong, was on this very land. Thomas looked at that girl in the mud and felt the weight of something that wasn't guilt. It was worse. It was recognition. He knew exactly how someone reached that breaking point. He took her inside. For the first few hours, the decision seemed simple. Thomas was a widower, living alone in the main ranch house with Tyler, his 20-something nephew who worked there more out of family obligation than actual desire, and David, the trusted foreman who had been on the property for 12 years. Nobody asked too many questions. David heated up some broth. Tyler brought out warm blankets. The rain kept coming down. But when morning broke and the sun still couldn't pierce through the thick clouds, Thomas discovered the first real problem. Emily wasn't just exhausted, she was terrified. A specific, deep-seated fear that she carried in the way she constantly checked the windows and flinched whenever a truck rumbled down the distant dirt road. She asked more than once if there were any security cameras at the ranch gate. Thomas told her no, and watched the relief on her face last for exactly 3 seconds before her eyes darted back to the road. He didn't push for answers that day. It was the country way. The story comes out when it's good and ready. By the second week, the rain finally let up, and the mud started to cake and harden. That was when Richard showed up. Richard was a manager for a massive corporate agricultural firm in the region. A man who wore tailored suits on sunny days and expensive boots when visiting the fields. The kind of guy the land simply didn't recognize as its own. He arrived with a wide smile and an offer to buy the ranch that Thomas had already turned down twice in the past year. This time, however, Richard didn't just talk about money. He hinted, in clipped sentences and with unblinking eyes, that he knew things about the property, about its past, that could make life very difficult for anyone who chose to stick around. Thomas sent him packing. but that cold stare stayed on his mind for the rest of the day. It was Tyler who, entirely by accident, connected the dots. Grumbling while fixing a broken fence line, he casually mentioned that he had seen Richard parked on the access road to the ranch 3 weeks ago, right before Emily showed up. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. He made Tyler repeat it, and when he understood what that meant, the chill that ran down his spine had nothing to do with the wind sweeping across the plains. Richard hadn't shown up because of the ranch. He had shown up because of her. The truth came to light slowly, like all serious matters in the country. Not in an explosive confession, but in a series of fragmented pieces that fell into place over days of heavy silence and lingering suspicion. Emily had accidentally witnessed an illegal, under-the-table deal between Richard and the former owner of a neighboring piece of land. She didn't fully understand what she was seeing at the time. She was only 12, waiting for her father who never came back from a meeting with those exact men. But she had kept one crucial detail locked in her memory. A string of numbers handwritten on a scrap of paper that she had glimpsed and memorized without knowing why. Years later, as an adult, she came across that exact same number again, on a financial document being investigated by a group of scammed farm workers who had been bled dry by that very same corporate firm. She hadn't gone after anyone. She didn't blow the whistle. But someone, somewhere inside that group, had talked too much in the wrong place. And her name had eventually found its way to Richard. Thomas listened to all of this sitting on the edge of Emily's bed as the rain started up again outside, a steady, relentless drizzle now. He kept his head bowed when she finished. He stayed like that for a long, quiet moment. Then he stood up and told her that she wasn't going anywhere until this whole mess was sorted out. Emily said there was nothing to sort out, that there was no way out, that there was never a way out for people like her. Thomas told her she was wrong. But his voice trembled just a little when he said it. The problem was that Thomas was no hero, never had been. He was a man who stumbled over his own stubborn decisions, a man who had wronged James years ago out of foolish pride, a man who had ended up alone on this sprawling land out of sheer stubbornness. David, the foreman, was the one who practically kept him standing on a daily basis, and it was David who noticed, on the third day after Richard's visit, that there were fresh footprints all along the perimeter of the property. Someone had circled the ranch under the cover of darkness, never stepping foot inside, just measuring the boundaries. Thomas tried to file a report at the county sheriff's office. The deputy at the desk was polite, took down his statement, and told him they would send a cruiser out within 72 hours. Nobody ever came. Tyler, frustrated and hot-headed, suggested confronting Richard face to face. Thomas shot the idea down, not out of fear, but because he understood that a man like Richard, cold, calculating, lacking any real attachment to anything or anyone, would never back down from a physical confrontation. He would only fold when faced with something he couldn't control. And it was with that logic in mind that Thomas started to remember something he had kept buried for years, never knowing if he would ever need to unearth it. 15 years ago, when the bad blood with James had reached the point of no return, Thomas had done something he had never breathed a word about to a living soul. He had hired someone to keep an eye on James in the days that followed, without James ever knowing. Not out of malice, out of genuine fear. He was terrified that James, pushed to the brink of despair, might do something irreversible. That someone was Martha, Miss Martha as the locals called her, an older woman from the neighboring town who possessed a photographic memory and a peculiar habit of writing absolutely everything down in spiral notebooks that she kept stacked in old shoeboxes. Miss Martha was still alive, in her late 70s now, and she still had the notebooks. Thomas drove out to see her with David, taking the battered old pickup truck down a dirt road the rain had practically washed away. They were greeted by a small, sharp-eyed woman who pulled the door open before they could even knock, telling them she was already expecting them. She had seen Richard's sleek SUV crawl past her front window 2 days prior and knew a storm was brewing. Inside those notebooks there were dates, names, dollar amounts, and the exact number that Emily had memorized as a little girl, jotted down by Miss Martha on a breezy March afternoon 15 years ago, right beside the name of the man who had carelessly recited that number out loud in a roadside diner, completely unaware that someone was taking notes. The name belonged to Charles. Charles was Richard's silent partner, the phantom whose name never graced a single legal contract, yet whose heavy hand could be felt in every major corporate maneuver. He was the one who, all those years ago, had orchestrated James's exile from the county by putting the squeeze on his boss at the time, which happened to be Thomas. The bitter feud that Thomas had sparked with James hadn't just materialized out of thin air. It had been carefully cultivated, fed by twisted lies and half-truths that someone had systematically planted in Thomas's ear with chilling patience. When the reality of that finally hit Thomas, he stayed quiet for so long that David honestly thought the old man was having a heart attack. He wasn't. He was simply digesting the massive weight of the damage he had done out of pure ignorance, and the monumental task of what he now had to do out of moral responsibility. The breakthrough came from the absolute last place Thomas expected, from Jessica, an administrative assistant at Richard's firm, who had grown up in the same small town as Emily, and who had been buckling for years under the weight of knowing things she was never meant to know. Jessica had reached out to the ranch through Megan, a distant cousin of Emily's who showed up on a gloomy afternoon in the third week, carrying a folded note, whispering that Jessica desperately needed to talk but was terrified to be seen. Thomas went to the meeting spot alone. Jessica was young, visibly shaking, speaking a mile a minute and losing her train of thought halfway through her sentences. But she brought proof, digital backups she had quietly copied under their noses, ledgers that perfectly tracked the dirty financial trail matching the exact numbers Miss Martha had scribbled down decades ago. The catch was that Jessica was absolutely petrified of Richard. She swore up and down she wouldn't testify, wouldn't sign an affidavit, wouldn't show her face in court. Thomas was free to use the flash drive she handed him, but he was entirely on his own, and he had to move fast, because Richard had scheduled a closed-door meeting with a high-powered attorney for the following week, a meeting Jessica claimed was solely designed to scrub the records clean before any formal investigation could gain traction. Thomas drove back to the ranch with the flash drive sitting heavy in his pocket, feeling the walls rapidly closing in. On the morning of the fourth week, the sky finally broke open for real. The relentless Texas sun returned with the sheer brutality of something that had been locked away for too long. That harsh, baking heat that turns mud to stone, cracks the earth wide open and forces everything hiding in the shadows out into the blinding light. Sarah, the federal agent from the Agricultural Labor Board who Thomas had tried calling for days on David's advice without hearing a peep back, pulled up into the driveway unannounced in a government vehicle flanked by two field investigators. She hadn't come because of Thomas's messages, nor because of Emily. She had received a formal sworn complaint from James. James was alive. After being chased out, he had crossed state lines, settling down a few states over, and slowly scraped together a modest but honest living. And through an underground network of seasonal farm workers that Thomas didn't even know existed, word had eventually reached James that his missing daughter had washed up at his old boss's ranch. He had done the only thing a father could do from hundreds of miles away. He pulled the trigger on the only official channel he knew he could trust. Sarah brought the kind of crushing federal authority that Thomas could never wield on his own. Armed with Jessica's digital files, Miss Martha's meticulously kept ledgers, and James's sworn affidavit, notarized and filed from states away, the legal hammer that came down on Charles and Richard was swift, devastating, and suffocatingly quiet, the way only airtight, paper trail investigations can be. Richard was escorted out of his corporate office and stripped of his operational duties before the week was even out. Charles, suddenly stripped of the loyal frontman who had shielded him for decades, found himself utterly isolated, watching his carefully constructed empire of influence rot from the inside out, his partners vanishing, his phone calls going to voicemail, until he was left completely alone, trapped inside the sprawling mansion that had once been his fortress of power, now just an oversized, deafeningly silent tomb. Emily went into labor early on a Thursday morning, bringing her baby boy into the world with the help of Miss Martha and a clinic nurse that David had hauled out of bed before sunrise. Thomas paced the hallway outside the bedroom, finally slumping onto a wooden bench, twisting his worn hat in his hands, just waiting. When the sharp, piercing cry of the newborn finally echoed down the hall, he dropped his head into his hands and stayed like that for a long time. David walked over and didn't say a single word. He just stood there, shoulder to shoulder with him. It was enough. Daisy, the fragile old cow nobody had believed in, had been slowly bouncing back over the past few weeks. She was standing tall, eating her feed, and Tyler had stopped complaining about having to check on her without even realizing it. There was something about that old girl that nobody could quite put their finger on. Every afternoon she would wander up to the gate near the main house and just stand there, as if she were waiting for someone. As soon as Emily was strong enough to walk, she carried her baby boy wrapped in a blanket right up to that fence. She rested her forehead in the exact same spot as before, against Daisy's wet snout, and stood there for a fleeting moment that required absolutely no words. Thomas watched from the porch and thought about James. He figured it was about time he wrote that man a letter. He didn't have the words figured out just yet, but he knew exactly where he had to start. With that bitter November morning when he had made the biggest mistake of his life, without even realizing what he was doing. Sometimes that's exactly what these harsh plains teach you. The earth dries up, it cracks, it looks completely dead. And then, when the right rain finally falls at the exact right time, it brings forth the very life that was supposed to be blooming there all along. 4 weeks. A young woman, a forgotten cow, and an old rancher who tripped over his own past. And what started with a desperate cry in the dead of night became, in the end, the only way back home for every single one of them. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every single day that will make your life a little brighter. Leave a comment telling me what you thought of my story and give it a rating from 0 to 10. And thank you so much.